Rich, thank you for joining me here today at the Jackson Hole Connection. It's quite an honor and delight to have the opportunity to sit down and talk to you.
Well, thanks.
I've heard your background through other people, but I would love for you to share with us today. What were you doing before you came to Jackson Hole? So where did you grow up? But then also, how did you find this magical place called Jackson Hole as well?
Okay. Well, I grew up in the San Francisco Bay Area. My dad was a naval officer shortly after I was born in Orinda, California. And he was a very avid outdoorsman, skier. He and some friends built a little lodge at Sugar Bowl up in the Sierras for skiing. And around 1947, he decided that he'd heard about Jackson Hole and thought that Jackson might be a good place to get skiing started because they really weren't doing very much here. He had a friend that had been here a couple of times. So he and this friend and my mom bought a little dude ranch in Kelly. Dad ran that and mom ran it. She was the cook and bottle washer and the waitress, and Dad took care of the stock and taking people hunting and camping and fishing and doing all the things that are fun to do in Jackson. And so we lived there from 47 until the Korean War broke out, and then Dad went back in the Navy and we left and traveled all over the place. Dad's last duty station in the Navy was as the assistant naval attaché in Rome, Italy. So I lived in Rome for 3 years. Came back, settled in the San Francisco Bay Area again in Los Altos, went to Los Altos High School, met my wife when she was a freshman in high school and I was a junior, and went from there. I wanted to go to Stanford, but Stanford took a look at my B+ average and said, well, maybe you better prove you can survive here. So I went to Exeter for a year and did a postgraduate year at Exeter in New Hampshire, hardest I've ever worked in my entire life. Came back, got about a C, barely a C average at Exeter, was accepted at Stanford and did very well there. And then went from there on to medical school at Baylor. A friend of mine that lived down the road got me interested in medicine. I worked as an orderly at the Palo Alto Stanford Hospital for several years. Went to Baylor, graduated from Baylor in 1969, did my internship, and then went into the Navy during Vietnam. So I was either going to enlist or get drafted. So I signed up for the Navy flight surgery program. Went to Pensacola for 6 months, got trained as a flight surgeon, got to fly, and then went from there. Our assignments were based on our ranking in our class, and there were about 12 or 14 of us in the flight surgery class, and I ranked fairly close to the top, so I got to pick a good assignment. I went to the Navy's Test Pilot School and Test Center at Patuxent River, Maryland. Spent 4 years there. Originally, I was going to go into obstetrics and gynecology when I finished my internship if I was going to go directly into residency. But after doing OBGYN plus some surgery, some pediatrics, adult medicine in the Navy, I decided, well, Baylor was going to start a family medicine residency. So I came back to Baylor with 2 other residents who'd been in the Air Force, who were in my class originally. And we started the Baylor Family Medicine residency for a little over 2 years. And then because I'd lived here in Jackson back in the 40s, I originally was going to come back and take over Dr. Crenshaw's OBGYN practice. He was going to retire about the time I was going to finish my residency. But I came back and did family medicine with a lot of obstetrics and gynecology for the first 20, 25 years. So that's the story, how we came back. Our little place was called the Ramshorn Ranch in Kelly, and it's now the Teton Science School.
Oh, is it? Okay.
That's where I lived, 1947 to 1950.
And when you came back here, when you were practicing medicine, is that where you lived too?
No. Dad sold to his partner when he went back in the Navy. His partner sold to the park, and then the park leased the ranch first to Katie Starrett, who had the Elbow Ranch there for a few years, and then she passed away. And then the people I'm trying to remember his name, that bought it, and it became the Teton Science School. I'll think of it in a minute.
It's all good.
That's the history.
And when you and your wife moved here to practice medicine and to live here, what year was that?
1975.
Okay.
And that house you see behind me, we bought in 1970 from a fellow named Nick Dietrich, who was a German immigrant that came here and raised silver fox. He bought a section at the end of Fish Creek Road and sold off pieces of it. And that was his cabin. It was a 1-bedroom cabin, and we added on a couple of bedrooms to it. But it was built in 1930 or early 30s.
Well, it's nice to know that you and your family have been able to preserve it and keep it alive.
Well, and I'm sitting right now in the homestead cabin, the original 1917 homestead cabin, which is my workshop. And so that's where I'm sitting right now talking to you.
And that was from Dietrich that homesteaded? It was his cabin?
No, that was the people that homesteaded the original property.
Oh, okay.
Dietrich moved here in the late 20s, 1928, 29, something like that, and bought that property.
And do you know who had originally homesteaded that property?
No, I don't. No. And that was, I got a phone call. Hang on for a second. It's not medical, so it can wait.
All right. Sounds good. And so when you moved here in 75 to practice medicine, what was the quality of care for this community? What was it like?
It was good. Don McLeod had just retired. We had a general surgeon, John Batson, was here. Dr. Melian was here in family medicine. Dr. Little in pediatrics. I was the second family physician along with Dr. Melian. We had a pathologist, a radiologist, and an internist. The care was good. I mean, for a small town, the hospital here was exactly the same size as the Naval Hospital in Patuxent River, Maryland. So I came from a small hospital to another small hospital, although in between, I practiced at a huge medical center. At the Texas Medical Center in Houston, we had something like 15,000 beds in 12 hospitals in a medical center.
That's a big facility compared to
huge
what was here. And what services did not exist for basic care when you came here that you, over time, you and other people saw a need for and started developing?
Well, one of the first things I got involved with was emergency medical care. There were 4 people at the time covering the emergency room, which included the radiologist and the pathologist. The pathologist had a couple of years of general surgery training, so he was capable of taking care of most things, and the radiologist was skilled at that, and they could always call one of us to take care of things that they couldn't cope with. But there were 4 people covering it, and when I arrived, Friday was the day that wasn't covered, and so they asked me if I wanted to cover Friday, and I said sure. And then I discovered that's rodeo day.
Huh.
I was busy on many Fridays during the summer, and then we all shared call on the weekends. But the thing we didn't have was an ambulance service. We had an ambulance. It was being driven by the maintenance workers at the hospital. They had no first aid training, no trauma training. They were basically just driving the ambulance, and they would grab a nurse off the floor at the hospital to go pick up a patient, whether it was a heart attack or automobile accident or a riding accident or a climbing accident. So the emergency medical services were barely minimum. John Fagan was an orthopedic surgeon who practiced here, and he had bought the Teton Village Clinic. And he asked asked me, he said he had a physician's assistant that was going to come work with him at the clinic in the wintertime, but he wanted to know if I would supervise him and could he work with me for the rest of the year in just general medical things. And this was a very talented fellow named Paul King. And Paul was a Special Forces combat medic who'd had several tours in Vietnam. Very well trained in trauma, very well trained in general medicine. And so I said, sure, I'd be happy to work with him. And he said also when Paul was at the clinic, if something came in that wasn't orthopedic, because Fagan was an orthopedist, would I, kind of help out there? And I said, sure. Well, we had patients that had bad head injuries. Well, let me back up before I get to the air ambulance, just about the regular ground ambulance. And Paul and I decided very quickly that we could do better than that. So we started Teton County Emergency Medical Services, EMS. We held classes and we trained first we started off training the maintenance people.
Okay.
They were driving the ambulance, training them to be first aid responders and then EMTs and advanced EMTs. And then we also started training some of the nurses and then some of the volunteers in the community to come in. And we held classes. I think we had either 2 or 3 classes a year, at least 2 classes a year. And we gradually built up the staff, improved the equipment on the ambulance. And then the other thing that we started working on was the concept of a trauma team. When we arrived, if somebody was badly injured in an auto accident, they waited until they got to the hospital before they called the surgeon or whoever else needed to come in and take care of that trauma patient, primarily the surgeon. And where I had trained, we had a very active trauma service at Baylor in Houston. And everyone was in the ER. And if you needed a specialist like a neurosurgeon for an accident, from the ambulance, the paramedics would call and say they had a bad head injury, they're going to need a neurosurgeon right away or a cardiovascular surgeon. They would call and the team would be ready when the patient arrived. And we thought we could do that here, and we did. And we got Brent, what was Brent's last name? He was the head of the trauma service at Scripps. Brent Eastman helped us organize that. And Dr. Batson, and then later on another surgeon came in, they agreed to it. And we started the concept of a trauma team. So we got the ground ambulance service going. And then also Paul and I served as the medical directors for the park ambulance service and coordinated that. So we got things on the ground going pretty well, but then we had the problems of having to take patients elsewhere for major trauma like neurosurgical trauma, bad head injuries, spinal injuries, things like that. And there was only, at that time, this would be the early 80s, there was only one air ambulance aircraft in Salt Lake. And if it was available, fine, we could call it and they would come pick up the patient. But if it wasn't, which was frequently the case, we'd have to relay these patients by ground ambulance to Salt Lake. So 4 hours, 5 hours, maybe longer in the wintertime. And sometimes they didn't make it. So we decided, I was a pilot, I was flying, we had an aircraft that we were using. So we decided to start an air ambulance service, which was a major undertaking. Actually, our first air ambulance flight was, I would fly down to Big Piney to see OB patients. And I was down there and the lady went into premature labor with a very premature baby. And Dr. Close, at the time, was the doctor there, who was a surgeon, but he was mainly a GP. He and I climbed in the airplane, and my nurse at the time was an OB nurse, Ruth Reed, and she had gone down with me. And so she was in the back with this lady in premature labor, and we flew her to Salt Lake. That was our very first flight. That was before we even got the ambulance service going. But it was one of the things that prompted us to, this is not that difficult, and we can do it. So we did it.